This is our Suburb Help report for September 2022, and we'll be looking at what investors need to know when they're looking at investing across the country. In this episode, we'll be discussing the concept of best house in the best street and best street in the suburb. And we will profile 5 suburbs and look at top streets and what changes we can see as we move from a seller's market to a buyer's market.
Welcome to The Elephant in the Room. This is the podcast where we love to talk about the big things in property that never usually get talked about. I'm Veronica Morgan, real estate agent, buyer's agent, co-host of Foxtel's Location Australia, and author of Auction Ready.
And I'm Chris Bates, mortgage broker. Before we get started, I need to let you know that nothing we say on here can be taken as personal advice. We always recommend you engage the services of a professional.
Don't forget that you can access the transcript for this episode on the website, as well as download our free full or forecaster report, Which Experts Can You Trust to Get It Right? theelephantintheroom.com.au.
Over the last few years, sellers have clearly had the upper hand with inventory levels at record lows, in fact. Now, limited supply relative to demand made it hard to find any property, but now many housing markets are returning to normal. And what is normal anyway? But that old saying, buy the worst house in the best street, was pretty much forgotten in recent years. And as market conditions start to favour buyers once again, we will explore this episode in today's podcast. Our resident Neek, that's my geek and nerd. I just sort of folded them together. You can be a Neek or a GERD. Anyway, Kent, hello. He has designed a new report called Top Streets. Let's dive in. So, Kent, can you tell us a bit about how you've designed the report and how it's used?
Yes, it's designed around taking an automated valuation model for every property in a given street, and then it takes the median of all those price estimates and then ranks them. Yes, well, so the call out there is obviously when we're using an automated valuation model, we need to understand how they work a little bit and how that can influence the result. What are some of the limitations of that? But generally what it does is it gives us something that's relatively weighted for every street, and it does it in a radius. So it effectively looks at a street, looks at the properties that are sold in a radius around that street and on the street, and gives us a price estimate for each property, and then we weight those all up and come up with a median for the street. So it's a very handy tool to actually identify where your street ranks relative to the suburb, but equally if you're somebody researching, a buyer's agent or a buyer looking at a street, it's something that gives you an understanding, is this one of the top ranked streets or is it one of the bottom
I think
ranked
it's
streets?
when I saw your report last week, I think it was on LinkedIn, I saw what you did. I didn't know you were doing this, and I contacted you straight away, right? I said, Can, I love this. Can you do this? Can you do this, right? Because I think especially if even people in the suburb, they don't really know their best street. They think their street's the best street. They think their house is the best house in the suburb, to be honest. We've all got that bias. But I think it's a really handy tool to at least know where your street ranks, right? And when you're out there looking at properties, are you discounting it for the quality of the street, or are you sort of comparing, paying top dollar for the street that's ranked, 98 out of 100? And so I think it's really interesting to sort of look at this. What are sort of the limitations with, all of a sudden, though, just going, okay, I'm just going to buy in the best street, or is that, what were some of the limitations of this research?
Yeah, it's a great relativity tool. So sometimes you might find that, rank 14 versus rank 15 might be disputable. Yeah, you might argue the toss on that. But what it does tell you is, am I paying well and truly above the median price for that street? So that's some of the detailed stuff that I can say, okay, if I'm buying the best house in the worst street, that's a very different proposition to the other way around, which we all like to talk about, buying the worst house in the best street. So it's very hard for people to measure or identify that. But I think the history has been in the last few years is you've just been happy to buy any property you could get. There's been so few listings. So the whole best street discussion disappeared from the radar. And I think it's just coming back online now.
I find really interesting, and that is that when it becomes a buyer's market as we are now, listings fall and good listings as a proportion. And, I guess what I need to do is literally get in there and work out some numbers around this. But that's very, very manual, because I've then got to determine what's a good listing and look at the proportion of good listings in a hot market versus good listings in a soft market. But my experience anecdotally has been that listings fall generally, and the proportion of good quality listings falls in a buyer's market, right? So that's the first thing. But secondly, and I did do some analysis on this some time ago. We had this sort of hypothesis in Balmain, so in like a good deeds local area hypothesis, if you like, which was that family homes with north-facing gardens turn over less often than family homes with other aspects.
Yep.
And we can see that properties that have that almost perfect, and whether the owners are conscious in their decision to keep those properties and never turn them over, or whether it's an unconscious thing. I suspect unconscious, to be honest. I suspect that just homes that are great in every respect, and that's one big one of them, you don't have this sort of sense of unease or discontent or whatever, and so you don't feel like you really want to improve upon it, and so therefore they don't come on the market that often. So that I have a suspicion that good streets turn over less often, and houses and best houses turn over less often. Can that be proven?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yes. Yeah. It's nodding because I have done that analysis before of the main street. So one of the things that the government categorises every street. So it's a code called a transport classification code. Nerding out here. 301's a freeway, 302's a highway, 303's a main feeder road, 304 and 305. So it's a way to categorise what is a main road or a feeder road. And I've done this quite a few times, and typically you will find that there's more turnover. Units are higher turnover, we know that. But houses on main roads have been more turnover because typically people get sick of the traffic, get sick of the noise. So that they do turn over. So of the studies I've done, and I have done this over the last 20 years, I think I've done it 2 or 3 times, and it was definite that the main roads, and in a boom times it's a great time to flog a main road property. You've got buyers who are just crowded out. They'll come and buy it.
Turnover is the key word here, right? And so the best street should have the lowest turnover. The reality is that's what makes it the best street, because once people are in that street, they live there longer. I mean, properties are turnovering less anyway. We're all living in our homes for longer because can't afford to upgrade. You've got to pay stamp duty. The gap to buy the next house is just too big, so you get stuck in the house that you're in now. But then you find that even the better streets will have a lower turnover rate, which is even lower when times aren't great to sell, because people are like, well, why would I sell this great property right now? I'm not going to get a premium price. It's a pretty good place to live. Why don't I just stay here? And so I think that's the irony, is that absolutely in the boom, people can't get the best streets, because to get the best streets and the best property, you've got to pay overs. And you've got to pay well above the market because someone else is, going to pay overs in a boom. So you have to make compromises. But when it's a downturn, you're less likely to get the good stuff because it's less likely to come on the market. So it's sort of catch-22 both ways, right? It's just very difficult to get the best properties in the suburb, no matter what the market is.
It is interesting. And Veronica, you mentioned earlier listings coming back. And a lot of the blue chip suburbs have been quite surprising, especially in Melbourne right now. So a lot of those premium suburbs have seen significant falls in listings. And I expected the opposite because it's meant to be, inventory's meant to be going up in the bad times. But one of the key things I found, I think we covered this in one of the early podcasts, was I selected to buy in Coogee one time based on some old data that analysed what happened in the bad times in Coogee. And all it did is go flat. So I can see there's elements of that likely to happen again, where the blue chip suburbs, people just pull them back. They decide not to sell. It's
actually really interesting because core logic data at the moment is, and has been pretty much for most of this year, is showing that the softest segment of the market. So they basically have each capital city broken up into 3 segments. There's the bottom 25th percentile, the middle 50 percentile, and the top 25th percentile. In terms of price falls, so first of all, you saw the slowing in growth, first of all, in the upper percentile. And then the falls have been greatest in the upper percentile. However, I've got a few clients with budgets that are in the upper percentile.
All of them.
In fact, most of my clients are, I think,
all
probably.
All of them would be, for sure.
And, some of those brackets, particularly family homes, are very competitive still. Very, in fact. And we're talking multiple millions of dollars here for some of our sort of upper level clients. There's a lot of buyers out there and they've got money. And I know that at the same time, talking to agents are saying that, look, people aren't necessarily feeling the urge to part with that money, that FOMO has exited the market, but those good properties still get very competitive. So it surprises me that that's still showing the biggest pullback in terms of prices, in that aggregate data. And I know we're going off piste here. We're not talking about best streets, but I'm fascinated by the mismatch with what we see on the ground and what the aggregated data says. And I guess that's in a way what we're talking about here too, because when you're looking at best streets in a suburb, you're looking at granular data. You're not looking at aggregate data.
Well, it's interesting. One of the points I wanted to raise is that it's a regression, and what you find is generally the markets will follow the path of, I use the SA3, the statistical area 3, and that median, the growth of that median, most of the suburbs regress to that median. Some might lead and jump ahead, and some might lag and fall behind, but over time they all regress to that long-term average. Same can be said for streets against the suburb trend as well. So that was point one, but point two is, really, if you've got a narrative that you want to support for a media headline, you can slice and dice the data any way you want. And what I did find with one recent analysis I did was that the top 20%, so I did it in quintiles, the top 20% in Sydney grew at a much greater rate in recent years than the bottom. But to the point of how you can slice and dice the data, that was for Sydney. Now, if you expand it beyond Sydney, suddenly the lower ranked stuff, you get a very different set of numbers to play with, and the lower price numbers come off on a very low base because of the Sydney exodus or whatever, and suddenly those numbers look very different. So if I just slice and dice Sydney alone, the top 20% did extraordinarily well, better than anything.
We should put that against Chris Joy at the moment. I mean, Chris Joy's been been our best forecaster on our reports, right, every year, but he's kind of getting into this camp where everything he's talking about, the top markets, top 25% is getting smashed, etc. But what you've just said there, Kent, is that's the market that grew the fastest over the last few years. And I mean, a lot of what he's saying is the market's fallen 6%. Well, it's actually fallen a lot more than that, because a lot of transactions takes, how many months does it take from something that's sold, today till it actually appears in, the settlements, and, you're talking a lag, and, it's actually a lot worse than what you're saying. He's saying market's fallen 6%. Well, Veronica would see that in the West, the poorer stuff would have fallen a lot more than 6%. And, some of the top stuff may have fallen similar to that. And so it's very dangerous using this sort of media and I agree, everyone's just cutting and dicing it to support their story without giving any context, because if you expand that over to 12 months, the market's still up over 12 months on a median basis. But if you just do that chart over the last 6 months, it's looking like the market's in free fall.
Yeah, well, and if you use some of the indices, I mean, it's the same point. We've got an AVM that's used to predict these house prices for the street ranking. The same methods or AVM type methodology that predicts house prices is used in a lot of the indices. Yeah. And so you've got limitations to these things. So you've got compositional impact or compositional bias. If the only thing that sells is cheap in a suburb, then that's going to bring it down.
That's now, isn't it? So if you think about it, if there's 100 properties on the market, it's going to be 70 or 80% of them might be poorer properties now. But in a boom, it might only be 50% of them, because a lot of people in the good properties, take their money, cash in, downsize, move to other states, upgrade, etc. And so your median's going to actually fall worse in downturns, because more percentage of poorer quality properties are going to sell, which is going to drag your median down. It's very dangerous, because if you're wanting to buy one of the better properties, you're saying, the market's down 20%. Well, you can't factor that onto the better properties if you're basing your decisions on the median. And all the AVMs do that, right? You can see that all the AVMs are discounting some of the better properties by bigger percentages and you won't get them for those prices, right? Those discounts.
And that's the sign. It's that compositional bias that we often talk about here. And the other point is that these things that we've attempted overcome these things with different index models, such as the repeat sale index or the Case-Shiller method, which looks at the same property selling through time and then builds a model on only that, where you've got 2 points of data for the same property. So, this compositional bias issue is a significant issue. It will be around for months and months to come as we go through this transition. But the other key point is a lot of people love to use the term machine learning and AI. Right now, the models are goddamn awful. The models are rubbish right now.
So what are you seeing there? Do tell.
Well, a lot of the machine learning models to forecast sales volume and listings volumes, which I use to then create an inventory forecast, those models, the performance of those models right now is woeful in comparison to how reliable and robust they were a year ago. Because it was, sorry that I'm using the wrong term, fat and lazy, but they were just fitting a line to a pretty steady growth curve. Whereas now we're getting wobbly and it's moving around. So I've had to shorten up that projection to bring it back up to the more robust statistical measures to say, is the model reliable or not? So it's not until we see a fairly consistent set of numbers and this short-term volatility, because there's some crazy stuff happening, as you said. You've got some suburbs that are shrinking in inventory right now because people are pulling back on listings. And usually what happens with decreased inventory, we see a 3 to 4 month lag, and that increases prices. So my take on this is, as people pull back on those listings, it's going to have a very much a stabilising effect on the price. Back to that Coogee example, where the blue chip suburbs, people pull back, it goes flat. It's a soft landing, not a crash.
I've got a little chart that tracks clearance rates, percentage of withdrawn properties from auction, and also the auction listings, so the listings volume. And I've been tracking those three all this year. And it's really interesting. And it's just for Sydney. And unfortunately, I haven't got it for, suburb or SA3, but for Sydney as a whole, it's really interesting watching those three lines on a chart. And certainly there was always volatility. For the beginning of the year, basically, there were high volumes and high clearance rates and low withdrawals. So that's sort of a normal New Year type market, really, where you got pent-up demand both to sell and to buy. And then you get Easter. Plus we had, obviously quite a bit of jawboning going on in terms of media, but then you get Easter and then it just goes all over the shop because you've got school holidays, you've got listings, volumes going up and down and zigzagging everywhere. You've got clearance rates, not quite knowing what to do. And same with withdrawn properties because of that volatility. So this is just showing volatility is what I'm talking about here. And then you get through that period through basically term 2 at school. And now it's since July, I think, in the middle of term 2. And then we've seen listings numbers fall. They're stable around about the sort of 400 to 500 per weekend. The withdrawn numbers has stabilised at around about sort of on average some about 18% withdrawn every week. And the clearance rate stabilised in that sort of early 50, between 50 to 55%. And it's just interesting, just as a data set, I know it doesn't directly relate to what you're talking about, but it's just getting into and understanding the volatility in our markets, even for myself who lives and breathes this stuff. And I'm like, wow, yeah, you can really see how it's impossible. Like a human being who knows these markets will go, well, I can explain this and that, blah, blah, blah. But for a bot or whatever it is that automated an AI, to try to make sense of all that without various inputs. I mean, I'm sure it looks for patterns, but there's no pattern for that period of time. How could it possibly...
That's exactly it.
Yeah. So therefore, its ability to predict will be just shot.
It's just, at the moment, it's shot. And people just love rolling out their rubber stamp on their website that says AI, and it's like yeah, right. that's a sign that I know those sites.
I think
to
it's
avoid
in
now.
property. There's such an emotional element to it, and all the behavioural bias which we've been talking about since episode 1. And loss aversion is real, even though it's paper money. A lot of people will be looking at 2022 prices, what they could have sold it for last year. There's uncertainty. Creates inaction. In uncertainty in share markets, you sell. You don't do that in the property market. You just sit still, right? You don't sell. You don't try to buy,
hunker down,
etc. Yeah. And in the last few months, in particular, I mean, there's definitely been some people who have been caught out, maybe bought earlier this year and had to sell. The last few months have been really not in a great place, to be honest, because the market moves. I think an interesting thing for our listeners to look at is the Australian government 3-year bond yield. And you can really see that really shows how fear ramped up this year because, all through 2020, 2021, the government bond yield was like, 0.1 or 0.2%. So cash rate's going to be cheap for the next 3 years. But then late 2021, it sort of jumped up to 1%. And then in sort of March, April time this year, it jumped up to 1.5%, 2%. And then basically, April, May, it went from sort of 2% all the way up to sort of in June, it went to 3.6%. So it went from like 0 to 3.6%. That's the cost of money for the next 3 years. And that's the government bond yield. So then the bank rates are much higher than that. But you can already see, this is almost exactly what's happened to our clients as well. From middle of June into July, the bond yield started to drop, and it started to drop from, 3.6 all the way down to 2.8, as in the market thinks that rates aren't going to keep on going up, right? And that's when confidence started to return a little bit for buyers, and people are saying, well, rates aren't going to go through the roof forever, et cetera. So I think that's just shows how the higher interest rates really freaked out the market. And I think that will correlate with listings because as rates started going up, people will say, I'm not going to, look to sell. I'm not looking to upgrade because I don't know where rates are going to go. And that's exactly the same with what happened to fixed rates. We started seeing fixed rates started late last year. They started going up. And then they really started all the way through the first 6 months of the year, started really jumping for clients. So
humans, you'd want to replace them with AI, wouldn't you?
This is the thing, though. I mean, it's like, we've recently interviewed Stephen Keane, for instance, and he's he's brilliant, absolutely brilliant. But, one of the things that kept going through our mind while we were talking to him was that humans don't necessarily act in predictable ways or even unpredictably or even predictably unpredictable. You know what I mean? It's like they're all over the bloody shop. And I think also it's been ramped up because of the way in which our news cycle works these days too. I just think that that volatility of humans' reactions has been dialed up as well. So, and so any model in a way has to somehow compensate for that, right?
So let's get into some suburbs, Ken. So what's the first suburb we're going to talk about today?
Yeah, so a couple of key things. So we picked on some suburbs that we all have some familiarity with. So Chris, you're familiar with Newport. Veronica, you're familiar with Newtown and Balmain. I'm an ex-Balmain person, so I put in Balmain. I'm ex-Coogee and I'm in New Lambton. So there's some suburbs. We don't need to cover them all. A couple of call-outs, though, is the number of listings. So Newport's listings have jumped up. So the average number of listings in Newport was about a year ago about 15 houses. It's up to about 27 average
so
now.
Let's just put a little bit of, locational context here. So apologies for anybody who's listening to this who is not from New South Wales, because you're going to go, why are you guys just focusing on New South Wales? So this is purely around, well, we're familiar. Interesting, though, Newport, Newtown, New Lambton. What is it about the news?
I know, it's very new.
So Newport, that's Chris's neck of the woods. We're talking Northern Beaches. We're talking if it's past, you're before the bends, aren't you? There's the bendy bus. There's the bends.
Yeah, very snobby.
Very snobby.
Pittwater. It's a beautiful place to live, but it's been plagued for decades because of its lack of, easy, reliable transport to the CBD. So people go there for lifestyle, often will turn around and come back out of there again because of the commute. But work from home movement, one of Chris's big champions, that has allowed the area to go off. So that's just a little bit of context. Anything else you want to add about your neck of the woods, Chris, before we get into the data?
It's a funny suburb, right? So there's a few flaws with the suburb. Obviously, transport's across the whole suburb, right? No matter whereabouts in Newport is, it's not easy to get to the city. And it hasn't even got like a fast bus. That's in the next suburb, which is called Monavale, just to the south of it, close to the city. But Newport's a funny suburb. You've got like one side of Barrenjoey Road, which is sort of the main road, which is, and that's split in two. You've got flat blocks that are walking to the beach and walking to the shops. That's like premium, like best, a couple hundred meters from sand, couple of meters from shops, and that's really premium. Then you got up on the hill, which is actually not a great walk to the beach, but you get a great views. So that's still really desirable. But then on the other side is you've got all flat blocks, but there's a massive escarpment. It's actually it's on the south side of a peninsula. And a lot of those blocks, there's a couple of cut-through roads, and, there's a lot of blocks where they're really dark in winter. You get no sun. And then you've got this a couple of really awful streets that get zero sun up inside the peninsula, and this is the problem when you're buying in a suburb, is you just don't know these things until years down the line you start to figure out like how the suburb behaves in different seasons and where the cut-through roads are.
Yeah.
And then you've got premium Newport, which is literally on waterfronts on Pittwater, which is sort of the like the harbour of up on the beaches. And so it's a suburb that's really mixed. If you didn't know, like sort of Kent's research is going to be interesting, so I haven't even seen it, but it's going to be interesting what comes out, because it's a huge gap between best streets versus the worst streets in Newport, and the livability in different streets. So what did you find, Kent?
Yeah, so a couple of key things in what we've got in here is the total address count, how many houses versus how many units on the street. Mm-hmm. So that's in there as well. So you can identify straight away, the proportion and the mix of property types and how many. So, a short street, a small street might only have seven houses on it. So there's quite a few that might only have 5, 6 or 7 houses. So that's the call out. There's 2 metrics we've got in here. We've got 3 in terms of the medians. We've got the overall property median, so houses, units combined. We've got one specifically for houses, so the median for the houses, and another one for units. So the median we've got here for the top street is called Gertrude Avenue. Now there's 28 properties in total, but 15 houses that have been used in the estimate, and that came in at a median of just under 4.9 million. Do you know Gertrude Avenue? Is that your street?
So has anyone seen the movie Penguin Bloom?
Oh,
so
yes,
it's Naomi Watts, isn't it? Anyway, the house in Penguin Bloom is, and you're right, there's only 4 or 5 houses on it. But why that's and I wouldn't say it is a pretty good street, but it's a walk to the town centre, but it's just got picturesque views straight up, and you can see all the escarpments of all the Newport, Bogola, up into Palm Beach, up into the Central Coast, and all your beaches. And it's a short little walk to the town. It's not too far up the hill, so you can make sense why that is basically the best street in Newport. And you don't get any. It's a quiet cul-de-sac as well, so you don't get the through traffic like Mayola is, which is the street it runs off. And so it sort of makes sense why that's up the top, but I'm surprised. And this is, I would say that the bottom part of Mayola, which is right down the flat blocks near the water, is a better street. But then you've got a really poor part of Mayola, which is where all the people drive up and down. So,
That's the thing,
That's
though, isn't it?
That's a good point, though.
Yeah.
Because you've got streets. We've got one street here called St James Road in my suburb.
Yeah.
And it's in 2 halves. You've got one half that's the premium end, and then you've got another one that runs up over the railway, is a high through traffic section.
Yeah.
So the other one's a quiet section, hardly any through traffic, and it shouldn't be one street. It should be renamed and zoned differently.
Well, it'd make it easier for real estate agents if you could actually name them differently. This is the good end, because otherwise, in the ads you often see the quiet end of this street or whatever.
Yeah, it's red and green. Red and green.
So what's the next street?
The next one's Carloo Parade. Karloo. Carloo. Do you know that one? Well, we'll stick with the ones you know. So if you'll just focus at I'll go through the list, and as soon as I hit one that you know, I've got Walworth, Stanley, Panama, but Panima.
I think these are the ones that are on the other side. So these.
I don't think.
So this isn't. I should.
There you go. We do have Bungenhead Road.
Is right next to Gertrude. So that's up on the top of on Carloo. So Carloo Parade, yeah, absolutely. So Carloo Parade is basically beachfront properties that are all overlooking Bungan Beach. The problem is, it's one of those streets though. Yeah, it's the top street, right? But all these properties are southeast facing. They're all on the south side of the peninsula. They're all pretty much dark all winter, and it's a cut-through road. So even though this has got the highest median, I don't think that's a great street to live on. And they actually do find that they don't sell anywhere near as well as the ones on the other side of Newport. They've got the picturesque views, but in markets like now, there's already one on the market now that they were trying to get 8 mil for, and they can't even sell it for 6 because it gets all the south sort of westerly sort of wind. It's dark and cold in winter, and Yeah, and it's actually that beach isn't the best beach because it's a massive walk down. So, yeah, it's interesting that that's come up as the second best street, but I would argue that it's not the second best street. So
we're talking based on the AVMs and the median prices. It's coming up as the best for average value. Is that correct?
Correct. Yeah. Correct. So if you've got, it's like when we talk about the distributions of a suburb. Sometimes you've got odd distributions. In a beachside suburb, you've got really odd distributions at the suburb level, and the same for the streets to the same point. You're going to have different ends of the street and different prices. So there's some of the call-outs, some of the limitations, but it does give us a relativity thing.
Could I add just potentially, for me, I look at that and go, well, probably it means that every single house in that street's got a view. And if you compared every single house in that street to there might be 5 amazing cracker houses in the suburb that maybe they're the only ones in that street with that view or something, then their streets wouldn't reflect the fact they've got the best house in them. But this as a street, everyone's got a view. So there's the views priced into them, even if they've got these other detractors. Yeah, it's sort of fascinating, isn't it?
It does use a radius, so it's going to be influenced by a blend of results in a radius off the street. So they're just some of the call-outs. But again, you mix something like this with on-the-ground local expertise, or you're dealing with a buyer's agent or a selling agent with 10 years on the ground, it's a pretty good mix.
Yeah. It's fascinating.
And go on the
stuff,
other
actually.
end, so
I love
you've
this.
got the best streets. What's like some of the worst streets in Newport?
Yeah, so some of the lowest medians, I'll select my language carefully here. So we've got a few that we couldn't rank, but we've got Suncrest, Hill Slope, Sybil and Robertson are some of the ones that had the lower.
The name Hill Slope? That just, I wouldn't find
it. It's a giveaway.
It's a giveaway.
Yeah, and I mean these are the ones that sort of are against sort of the escarpment. They're going to be dark, they're cold, they're wet, and they're not going to be, if you are the entry point into the market. And I think it's just in hot markets, you just don't want to be paying over the odds for these type of properties, because that gap between the poor streets and the best streets really tightens, because people just get desperate to get in. But in down markets, they're a lot more likely to sell because people are more worried that they're not going to hold their value. You start seeing other people sell, and you say, well, if I don't sell now, it's going to be worth less next year. They really get discounted because everyone's like, well, why would I buy that property? I'm going to wait and try to get something better. And so that's, cool. Awesome. So what's the next place we're going to talk about? Newtown?
We're going to go to Newtown.
Woohoo! My neck of the woods.
Your neck of the woods. So one of the top ones we got, Samuel Kent was one. I don't know if you know that one. Railway Avenue.
This is funny.
You know that one?
No. I should. I don't know either of these.
I got one that I know quite well. My late father owned a property for a long time in Randall Street, Newtown. So I know that one. That's up in the top 17. So I know that one. So I'd agree with that. That's a pretty good position.
Yeah.
Hang on, you might be having a bias there, though.
So I've totally got a bias, but it's a big, wide street. It's a beautiful, wide street, easy access
I used to live in Newtown as well. So,
Samuel Kent.
I used to live on Brown Street in Newtown, which is off Wilson Street. And Wilson Street's the one that runs all along the carriage works. It's full of terrace houses, and you got
mixed bag past, and there's different sections of it. So some sections got traffic, some don't.
That Wilson Street at the moment, it's right next to the carriage works, and that's whole areas getting huge refurbishments. The whole Central to Everleigh project. If you're looking to buy in the inner west, you want to know exactly what's happening with that. And so because it's going to be together with apartments and commercial and etc. But Randall Street is just off Wilson Street. It's a cute little, quiet little street. It's got a beautiful park at the end of it. And so I know that street well. It's you can see why it'd be the best because it's surrounded by. Got amazing access to the main roads, quiet little pocket, all terraces and a big wide street. So,
well, it was number 17 on the list. So it was. I'd probably rephrase it as one of the best, but I went straight to it because I knew it. And there's 122 streets there. We ranked most. We ranked everything bar about. Or we didn't rank 30 of them. So sometimes we just don't get enough. A lot of those are lanes. that might only have one or two properties. So, but yeah, some of the top ones, Railway, Warren Ball, Forbes. Do you know any of those?
Look, Warren Ball, definitely. Forbes. Okay, so and that Randall is up in North Newtown. So it's funny because I do these little videos for when I have new people coming on my team, and also for our clients too. And we do sessions called Getting Started sessions for clients, where it helps them understand the possibilities for their property search. And also, one of our big value adds is to educate them as to other areas they may not have considered. Right. So we do these little suburb overviews. So for us, different ones in my team, particularly knowledgeable in certain areas, and I've did my one on Newtown, and that area up near Warren Ball, that Warren Ball, like if anyone goes there, and it's on the corner of Georgina Street, and it is obviously way back in the Victorian times, that was where very, very rich people went, right? I've never been in a house on Warren Ball. Right, it overlooks Hollis Park. It's beautiful. Yeah. It's like an English. It's like you imagine sort of this English in the middle of London. These manors, right? Mm-hmm. And it's like this is in the middle of Newtown, feral Newtown. It's amazing. But so up that northern end of Newtown, there's some lovely streets, some lovely big wide houses, all the rest of it. But it's sort of interesting because that Samuel Kent is really a lane, and it's off Camden Street on the other end, and it's awful part. Well, so I'm really curious to know what's...
Yeah, well, it was included with one sample. So what I could do is I could filter it, you see, and I could say, look, to make this relevant, I'm only going to include stuff that's got, say, 5 sales or above, which would make Railway, if I said 5 properties and more in the sample, it would put Railway up at the top.
Right now, it's Railway Rock, Crescent or Avenue?
Railway
with this
Avenue.
Warren Ball, though, this is exactly that park I was talking about, which is near Wilson Street. It's on. They are massive, big terraces that have got a north-facing rear, and at the front of the property, overlooking a beautiful park, and no commercial out the back. It's just houses, and you've got a laneway. So you've got rear lane access with a north-facing with a big terrace, in a row of terraces that are all on the. There's only 6 of them, or 8 of them, so you can see why there's just true scarcity. And you're off the main road, so it's no noise. And I can see why that's the best properties, the highest medians in Newtown.
Definitely. Now, you got to put some more filters in here, Kent. So this is what I love. I love you, and I think you are the best property data person alive. But Railway Avenue, Newtown it's not a total dog. We have actually bought on this street once under certain circumstances and a certain little part of it. But most of it, literally, it runs along the railway. There are some lovely houses there, and it is very wide and a lot of trees and everything. So there are some nice aspects to this street. There are some pockets, but I'm really amazed that that's on there.
That's come up. Well, if it's close to these other premium streets that we covered in that north, it's going to capture them.
That's the issue.
No, it's not. So that's the thing. It's right at the other end. Newtown is a very funny place because you go in some pockets. The streets are so skinny. You talk about your government rating of streets. They're so scrawny and skinny. Like my daughter's just got her L's. I don't know how does anyone learn how to drive in a place like Newtown?
You don't.
It's just impossible.
You don't drive there. You catch the train.
Oh, that's what I've told her. Exactly right. But look, the point being, and then on the other end of the spectrum, you can have some very wide streets, some really beautiful big homes. Then you've got lots of tiny, tiny little workers' cottage, and you've got quite a lot of social housing as well. So you've got to carve up, what is affected by social housing. And when I say social housing, I'm also referring to a lot of really old, owned in the same families for decades, effectively slumlord type properties. You don't really want. There was a fire in one recently. Anyway, do go on. What's the next one on?
Well, let's. Do you want to jump across and follow? Do another suburb.
Do Balmain.
Well, I'm going to go jump to New Lambton. This is my suburb. Then we'll come back because I wanted to talk about Coogee. I wanted to focus on Coogee because it's so many apartments that it does create a bit of a challenge, and we'll talk about some of those. But what I can see in the top streets with places like Curzon Road, Carrington Parade, Queens Road and Addison Road and High Street. These are definitely up in what they call the Golden Triangle.
Every
so these are in the top 10.
Golden Triangle, hasn't it?
Which is yeah. And so these are, a lot of these streets go up nice and high with views back across the whole of Newcastle, and often some of them see the beach views as well. And one call out I've got here is my street has been ranked one below another one called Sketchley, which is adjacent here, which made me realise I need to put in those transport classification codes, because Sketchley is a feeder road, whereas mine's a 305. So it's a great way to reorder those that might be, because at the moment they're only ranked on the median AVM. But if I were to pick that, I'd say, well, hang on, I'd pick the street that is not the feeder road. So you'd flip that around. So that was a bit of a learning. But I think by and large, my suburb, which is a couple of suburbs back from the beach, it's worked rather well.
The beach is a long way from New Lambton, Kent. It's
it's about 6 minutes in the car, about 7 or 8. But as you get further away from the beach, the automated valuation models start.
You're not going to see any sand though. Just letting you know, you might see a tiny bit of water, but it's
yes, it's like my views of the water went from the property in Coogee on Carrington Road. They were water views, but boy, they were a long way away.
Some binoculars for those. But I mean, New Lambton, I grew up in Lambton, so literally next door. And, New Lambton did have a bit of a price premium on it. It was always known as a bit more where the wealth went, right? And so you're saying a lot of the older wealth is in that just a few handful of pockets, and you would say that,
handful of streets.
They live there, they've been living there for 30, 40, 50 years, and the turnover, you probably very rarely see those properties for sale in that pocket.
Yeah, and look, what's interesting about a suburb like this, and we covered it earlier, is a lot of the main roads do start to turn over or have been turning over in the last year. And the other call out is there's been a little bit of rezoning. We didn't talk about this earlier, but one of the tricks is that when a street gets rezoned, it has an adverse impact on the price because developers are suddenly buying in. So we've got one street called Queens Road, and we've got another one called Kings. And it's funny, one's a real premium. The Queens is the premium one that runs in that Golden Triangle. The other one called Kings runs along adjacent to the railway, but they're big 1,200 metres size blocks, and it's been rezoned R3. So developers are coming in, and suddenly you knock down one house and you build 5 or 6 townhomes. So the prices on that street have surged. So there's some call-outs there, getting deep in the weeds. But, understanding the zoning is a big consideration as well.
I love this because, you and I, when we're talking about what we're going to do with Suburb Help, this is a big thing, isn't it? Data is really valuable, but you need to know how to use it, and you absolutely 100% need local knowledge. Otherwise, you run the risk of making awful decisions if you just look at data on its own. And you and I rant and rave about these fly in, fly out buyers agents for this reason. That they use data, and some of it would look really logical. A lot of decisions based on data alone could look very, very logical. But if you don't understand these really critical local aspects, you're going to make crazy decisions that you'll only know in 10 years' time that you've made a bad decision.
I think the local expertise gets you nearest the pin.
Yeah. So, and one of the things that also just popped in my head when you were talking then was that if it really is the best street, like we were talking about, the best street in a suburb is going to have less turnover than lesser streets. So therefore you've got less data to use. And so sometimes they might actually miss the list because they actually don't turn over, and if they don't have if they get filtered out because not enough sales.
Well, it would radiate out. So to produce a price estimate for a house on a street that's has a very, very low turnover or no turnover, there still will be price estimates, but there will be less result from sales in the street itself. So, if you're adjacent to some lower value streets, it's going to have an adverse impact and scale you incorrectly. But by and large, generally a good street isn't amongst a lot of dodgy ones. So generally they're done in pockets.
So let's go into Balmain. We obviously
Let's go to Balmain.
I was about to say, because in newer suburbs, there's a little bit more order around that, but in somewhere like Balmain, it's completely
a toughie.
It's all over the shop.
Yeah. So, again, you've got a lot of small ones, so I could probably filter this, and I'll remove anything with less than. I might even go a bit. I might go say we'll test this out, and I'll do 10 houses or more, so we get rid of some of those really oddball lanes. So, what that now does is it gives me a rank. I'll just check I got the ranking. Yeah, so the highest median value street at 4.9 million after that filter is Alexander Street.
Right. Okay. Well, and that's right down on the harbour front. So, and in fact, interesting enough, it's one of the very few streets in Balmain that is in Balmain that's on the harbour, because you've got Balmain East and you've got Birchgrove. Yes. Taking a lot of those harbour spots. So that doesn't surprise me that. It's got gun barrel views of the Harbour Bridge. And it's only a fairly short row of houses actually, and in fact, a number of them I think were recently built or redeveloped and renovated. So that would actually explain as well why you've had quite a few sales there in recent years for that reason. So that's sort of quite interesting. But yeah, the views are pretty incredible.
The total result was about 104 streets after that filter. And I just zoomed down and found the old street that you sold me, the house that you sold me, and Arthur Street. And that's come in at 47, so it's kind of right in the middle, halfway.
Okay, interesting.
The next one on the list there after the filters was Longview Street. It's got a view in it. That's good. I always like the view.
Yeah, interesting.
And then the next one down is Ewanton.
Yeah. So Ewanton is an interesting street. It's got some quite large townhouses on it and a few very large homes. And it runs sort of from Darling Street down to White Bay. So it's a bit of an odd little pocket. But it is getting down towards Balmain East, so that's quite popular in terms of accessibility to the city via ferry, et cetera, et cetera. And Longview is over near Elkington Park, which is a beautiful park. And Longview itself, I don't get excited about Longview Street, but once again, it's because it's on the water. You've got waterfronts on that street, and so therefore they're going to sell for a higher price purely because they're waterfronts. But I guess if you then chuck them into the mix with the Birchgrove and the Balmain East waterfronts, you probably, and the pecking order would change. Longview would be right down the bottom of those streets potentially. So it is fascinating though, isn't it, when you think of when you chuck it all in.
So what are some of the worst streets?
Is
it Mullins, Darling, Beatty?
I'm just going down. I just want to make sure I got the ones that do have the estimates. So I'm just going to make a little marker there so I don't go to the ones that aren't rated. Carrington Street, Queens, Rosebery, Batty and Higham have come in.
They're the worst.
They've come in down the bottom with medians down below $2 million.
Okay, so Batty, 100% agree with. Like, why would you buy a house in Batty Street anyway? Batty Street is right on the edge of Rozelle. It's sort of on the edge of this massive Meriton redevelopment that was done 25 years ago now. And the actual, it's not very pleasant, to be quite frank. So that doesn't surprise me. Rosebery, depending which one, there's a Rosebery with two R's and there's one with one R.
Rosebery Place.
Rosebery Place. That's in that Meriton development, okay. Rosebery Place. So that answers that. What was the other one?
We've got Higham Street.
Yeah, Higham Street, same deal. That is all of that is massive, huge, big complex. Mind you, within all that, there's actually some decent apartments in there, but it's just a sheer volume, and. Yeah, interesting.
Here's one that's interesting. It's kind of not right down the bottom, but Little Darling. So we all know Darling, but Little Darling.
I sold, when I was a sales agent, a house. Little Darling's tiny street, and it has this real total mismatch. And it's right behind the what was the Telstra.
Yes. Yep.
And the courthouse.
The fire
so
brigade.
It's pretty horrible.
Yeah.
All that, what was the other one? There was one other one you said that I went, oh, yes, interesting.
Buchanan?
Buchanan. That's the second phase of all of that Meryton
stuff. Okay, we'll get off that list.
So it's interesting that.
But is there an issue with cruise lines down there as well,
Dick Street,
Veronica, where a bit of when they're docked and they've got their engines fired up and the smell goes down there as well?
That's the same part of Balmain, but that's not much. Right up that end. So I guess what this is reflecting, because there's no other unit complex in Balmain that's as enormous as this Meryton complex. So therefore, it stands to reason. It's not necessarily to say they're even necessarily bad apartments in there. It's just the sheer volume of it and the scale of it. And it's really interesting that it just keeps coming up, because there are units in other streets that are fine, and there's other units in other streets that you probably would put as a lesser product than these streets. But it is interesting that predominantly it's they're all at the bottom end of the
Well, this has been done on house price estimates, and we do have a column.
Well, there's no houses.
But we've got.
Oh.
What it's done is it's effectively selected. Well, it's got, pick one of them. Batty had.
There's houses in Batty. Yep. But there are no houses in Rosebery Place. There's no houses in, I don't think Dick Street's got any houses. Why would you buy in Dick Street either, just quietly? But it's got townhouses and units. Higham is townhouses and units. Like, these streets don't have any houses. So
it's probably all classification.
Something's made
classification of townhomes as houses. Do you want to make a switch over to, so Coogee's quite a challenge, because I'll move on now, because it's got so many units. So that does make things quite challenging. So, one of the options is to look at it and do it by apartment value. So this might be an interesting different angle. Is I'm now sorting and ranking based on apartment valuation estimates. So, but again, I'll filter it and only pick areas that might have more than 10. And that list has come down a fairly short list now, and that's only 49. So if I'm doing those that have a minimum number of the minute, and it's some of the big ones, Richard, Alfreda, Edgecombe. I don't know any of those. I can't remember any of those.
I don't either.
The only one that I know that's in that top 10 list was Dolphin. So I know that
Dolphin.
Well. So I might flip away, because I don't know those ones too well. I might need to change that and sort by houses.
You know what's interesting, though, with units, if you're trying to sort of pick a good street to buy a unit in, the reality is that it's almost like you need to find the good building, not the good street.
Well, I call them vertical
and also
streets.
the good apartment in that building almost. Like, it's, you could be a great building, but if you're the worst apartment, the dark one, the one on the, the south side, the smaller block, the noisy one, huge differences in terms of what will happen in a hot market, right? Like, and in a cold market as well. Like, if you wanted to sell the poorer one in the apartment block, people go, I don't really like this one because it's, but in a hot market, maybe you can get away with it. So, it's a whole other level to houses in terms of trying to pick a quality asset, I think, is to get a great investment.
It's a bit of a challenge. Yeah.
What I particularly love about this is that this is really interrogating data. Right, you've come up with beautiful, clever little filters and all the rest of it, and now we're going, right, well, what does that mean, right? And like Richard Avenue, I was thinking, I don't know it. I do know it. I hate that street, like, with a passion, right? And it wraps around to this other street that they're all dank houses. There's a bit of a hill, but there's not many units in there. So it's interesting that has filtered itself out in the unit data to be a good street. And it's probably because there's not a lot of actual unit buildings in it, perhaps. So it's like telling a story. I'm not sure it's the right story, but it's definitely telling a story.
I lived in Carrington Road in an apartment that was a beautiful apartment with some views, but very noisy. And I've just sorted it by house price estimates, and my favourite street in Coogee was Marcel. It was beautiful, and that's come up at after some filters, that's come up at number 5 with Battery number 1, and then Gordon Avenue. I think Gordon Avenue is down near towards Gordon Bay, or attached to Gordon Bay, but I think I need to check that one. If you could maybe Google that one and tell me where Gordon Avenue is.
Well, it is, and Battery is on the other side of that as well. So Battery sort of runs along the top part of Gordon's Bay, and Gordon Avenue runs along.
That's a beautiful part
and so
of the world.
on Gordon Avenue, Yeah, you got amazing, homes with views there, like stunning. Yeah, really beautiful. It's that whole envy you drive. There's property porn streets,
yes.
those ones.
If you were a really rich media person, that's where you'd be, right?
Potentially.
There's lots of options.
Although I think there's Bronte as well, rich.
But I mean, I think the whole top street thing, I think it's really important. So can people get this for their own suburb? Like, is there an easy way?
Yeah, so come along it's on Suburb Trends. I'm about to put it onto the website. It'll be available on Suburb Trends for download.
And so you can put in your suburb and then you can basically see your streets. Now, don't take it as gospel, as you can see already, but I think it's important if you are even thinking about a suburb. I think this is a great report to think about. Why is this ranking pretty low? Should we be a bit hesitant buying on this street? We're not looking, and we're comparing a street in the top 5 to the, that's at 80. And there's obviously some reason why this street's much lower. And that's probably a means to go and do a bit more investigation, right? And a bit more due diligence, etc.
It's got a lot more in it too. It's got the average bedroom count, the average lot size count as well. So it's got there's a lot of data fields attached to it. So it's a fairly rich data set, and it'll be just available as a download as an Excel file.
Oh, you are just amazing to provide all this information for people, Kent. Thank you so much. Well, yeah, interesting chat. I love this. I loved it that, I think the first time we interviewed you, well, not maybe not the first time, the first time we did a Suburb Trends episode, and I know that you came along with some data and we were talking about why properties prices are going up in certain areas and going down in others, and we were like questioning it, why? And it was like, well, I don't know, I'm just telling you what the numbers say. and it's so fascinating that you're brave enough to come on live. Like, we're not live, we don't actually broadcast this live, but we record it live and we don't edit it. So I just love the fact you're delivering this stuff to us and we can go,
don't hold back either.
Does this make sense?
You lay the boot in sometimes.
I know, but we love these conversations. Thank you so much for joining us again.
If you're looking to buy your dream home or an investment property in Sydney's inner west, eastern suburbs or North Shore, my team and I can help you buy without regrets. Reach out via my website, gooddeeds.com.au.
If you're looking to buy your first home, thinking of upgrading into a new one, or purchasing an investment property anywhere in Australia, my team love to carefully guide you on this journey. And most importantly, get the finance right. Reach out via our website, wealthful.com.au.
Thanks for joining us. We'd love to see you again.
And remember, don't be a Dumbo.